about what those issues were. The issue has to do with the status of Gentile believers in the Jewish/Christian church. We need to remember that the earliest Christians considered themselves to be faithful Jews. It had been known for a very long time, for millennia, that Gentiles could become a member of the Jewish faith. They had to go through a series of training and discipline. They were called proselyte Jews when they became a full-fledged Jew. But part of the Judaism would be obeying the religion, going to synagogue, praying, almsgiving, saying the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, but would also, for men, mean circumcision, no matter what your age. It would also mean keeping the dietary restrictions. And of course, once the Pharisees are on the scene, it would mean abiding by the Pharisaical instructions with regard to dress, ceremonial days, and things like this. The early church considered that if you were going to become a Christian, you were also becoming a Jew, and so you must also do those things. This seemed to be quite consistent. But we find with Paul, when he went on his first missionary journey, that when Gentiles were converted to the Christian faith, he did not require them to do those things. And so the issue was set up in Acts 15 for the church to decide this issue. Here's how Acts 15:1 records the event. Certain people came down from Judea, that is probably in Jerusalem, to Antioch, and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Notice that these certain people are Christians coming from Jerusalem, Christian Jews coming from Jerusalem, telling the Christians in Antioch that the Gentiles there have to keep the dietary restrictions. And yet Paul, in his missionary journeys, which were quite successful, had not required Gentile converts to adopt the Jewish requirements. And so this set a real tension as what is the status of Gentile believers? Let me turn to that for just a minute. Notice that the issue is not whether a Gentile can be a Christian or whether a Gentile can become a Jew. That has been known for thousands of years, that Gentiles could do that. The issue is twofold. One, how do they become a part of the Christian church? Do they have to keep the dietary restrictions, kosher, circumcision, etc.? And the second issue, and the biggest one for Paul, has to do with the status of Gentile believers. Paul was keenly aware that when a person became a Jew, but they were actually a Gentile, that they were considered to be a second-class Jew. They were not a full-fledged member of the faith because they didn't have the correct ethnicity. They didn't have the right racial mix. And so Paul instantly was keenly aware that if this was allowed, it would create a kind of first-class version of Christianity, those are the Jews, and those who are the rest of us who would fly in coach. And so Paul insists that Gentiles don't have to keep the dietary restrictions, that those were for the Jewish Christians only. And so Paul and Barnabas go down to Jerusalem to talk to the Jewish leaders there, Christian leaders there, and they provided testimony about their success on the way. We don't have time to read the entire text. You've already read it. The decision comes in Acts, in the final chapters. It is delivered by James. Now, this James, if you read carefully, this is the brother of Jesus, not the brother of James and John. Remember, James and John were that pair who were called the sons of thunder by Jesus. James, the brother of John, had become a martyr about 2 chapters prior to chapter 15 in Acts. And what we find is that Jesus' own brother becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He will later write the book of James that is attributed to him. But here is what his final decision is after hearing various testimony from Peter, from Paul, and from Barnabas. He says, it is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals and from blood. Now let's unpack this just for a minute. Notice that Gentiles do not have to be circumcised, keep the dietary restrictions, etc. Instead, what it means to do, abstain from food polluted by idols. We've already talked about this issue, but the issue of food that had been dedicated to the various pagan idols in Greek cities was a major issue that Christians had to deal with. Can they go up to those temples and eat the food at the temple? And secondly, can they buy it at the market and then take it home and eat it? That issue will be dealt with quite extensively in the book of 1 Corinthians, and we'll talk about it there. But notice right away, James says there are some rules for Gentiles. They have to not go up to those temples. That's probably what he means there on abstaining from food polluted by idols. Don't get involved with idolatry. Secondly, from sexual immorality, the sexual practices of the Jewish people were very different than the sexual practices of the pagan Greeks and Romans. And so essentially, sexual immorality, according to the Jewish faith, was any sexual activity outside the bonds of marriage between a man and a woman. And so James is here laying down the rule that Gentiles must abide by the Jewish sexual moral restrictions. No sex outside the bonds of marriage between a man and a woman. And that was very contrary to the sexual license of the pagan and Roman world. So Christians, their Gentile Christians, their sexual standards have to be the same as their Jewish Christian brothers and sisters. And secondly, lastly, from the meat strangled of animals and from blood, this is also probably reference to various kinds of idolatrous practices that may have been practiced in the ancient world, that they were supposed to stay away from the meat and animals that had been killed in a sacrificial way up at those temples. So you can see there that in terms of, if you want winners and losers on this issue of, was Paul right, were these people from Judea right about the status of Gentile believers? Paul kind of wins the day here, according to the book of Acts. Now we'll find later on in Galatians that he'll actually tell us that this didn't go as smoothly as Acts seemed to suggest. And so, but we'll talk about that when we come to the book of Galatians. About Paul after his conversion then. So he has an important Jerusalem council which gives him permission, really, or approval to continue doing missionary work exactly as he's done. And so he goes out on a second missionary journey, according at the end of the book of Acts. And this is the first time he will go into mainland Greece. I'll show you a map here in just a moment about that. And then he returns back to Antioch a few years later and gives a report, and they send him out on a third missionary journey, in which he pretty much retraces the steps of his second missionary journey. There are some differences, but he goes back to some of the same churches he'd been at before. Again, I'll show you a map in just a moment. After that, at the end of his third missionary journey, Paul goes to Jerusalem. And there, the reason he goes to Jerusalem is because he has made a vow to God, some special sort of vow he had made. This is talked about in the Old Testament, something that someone could do. And Paul needs to go to the temple to complete that vow. The temple was in Jerusalem. Now, just one thing I want you to note there is that notice Paul himself still considers himself to be a faithful Jew. He still is going back to the temple. That's where he needs to keep his vow. While he is there, after this third missionary journey, he goes and he preaches the resurrection of Christ on the temple grounds. And this causes a riot. We've already talked about the importance of the resurrection for Christian belief, and also what it meant for Jews and Sadducees, that it was a sign that Jesus was the Messiah, and they didn't like to hear that kind of idea. And so there was a riot ensued. Paul is threatened. They're about to hold a trial. He has heard that there are going to be assassins who are going to try to kill him before he gets to trial in Jerusalem. And so what does he do? He appeals to the Roman emperor. Paul, as you may recall, is a Roman citizen, and this is a very serious case. So he demands to be heard by the emperor himself. And so he is put in prison under a kind of house arrest He's got a group of soldiers around him that are not only keeping him, but they're also protecting him from these would-be assassins. But for the next few years, he is going to be traveling from Jerusalem to Rome under house arrest. Now, house arrest means he's not behind bars, he's not in chains yet. He's kept in a house. He can receive guests, and he can write letters. But this is the time of his imprisonment, and that's between 57 and about 62. At the end of the book of Acts, notice that takes us to the end of the book of Acts, chapter 28. We find him in Rome under house arrest, awaiting a trial that apparently he's quite confident he's going to be exonerated, he's going to be acquitted. We don't know what happened after Acts 28, at the end where he's left in prison. Some people suggest, based upon some of Paul's letters, that he's so confident he's going to be released that he got released, and if he did, he likely went on a fourth missionary journey. Now, according to the book of Romans that Paul wrote, he tells the Roman church that he's confident he's going to be released from prison, and when he does, he wants to go on a missionary journey to Spain. So some people suggest that Paul, in fact, after Acts 28, after Acts is ended, Paul, in fact, is released, and he goes on this fourth missionary journey. And if that happened, it would have been in this time period, 62 to 65. Subsequently, though, that would have meant a second Roman imprisonment that is accounted for in some of the other letters that Paul writes, in which he is in chains. He is not confident of release, and he's on his way to death, and he knows it. If that's the case, he was imprisoned a second time in a dungeon, punished, and then beheaded by the emperor, 65 to 67. So really, he may have died. It could be the case that he died sometime around 62. That is, his confidence of being released in that first Roman imprisonment did not come to fruition. Or it could be the case that he, in fact, was released. But again, we just don't know. It's a bit of speculation. But let me show you the pathway that he went, according to Acts, on his journey. Here it is. You can see that he's leaving the church in Antioch and then going to Cyprus, and then in just a few cities in southern Asia Minor, Turkey, in which he's starting churches, and a largely Gentile audience is hearing the gospel and turning to Christ. So you can see he goes on that southern journey. Then on his journey, this is the first time you can see he goes over to mainland Greece. Go up there in the north where it says Troas. You can see that he eventually goes over to Philippi and Neapolis, and then down the coast of Greece to Corinth and Athens and the other cities there, and then back to Judea and Jerusalem, and eventually back to Antioch for that second missionary journey. And then, I'm skipping over quite a lot here, recorded in the book of Acts, and these journeys take him years to traverse this. It's all on foot. The Roman roads make it easy to travel relatively, but we're not talking about getting on a subway or a train or a plane or anything like that. He's walking and staying a long period of time at each of these. And then finally, his third missionary journey, accounted in Acts 18 through 23, he goes again to southern Asia Minor and then over to mainland Greece and then back to Jerusalem at the very end, where he is arrested at the temple because he preached about the resurrection. So let's just review key transitions we've talked about in the book of Acts. Remember, we mentioned before that it begins as a Jewish-only religion, and by the time we get to the end of the book of Acts, it's become universal. All kinds of people are now turning to Christ. That universality, of course, was foreshadowed in Acts chapter 2 with Pentecost, with those people from all different languages are now speaking a single language. And so you get a kind of echo or a hint that was going to happen. More specifically, it's moved from a Jewish-only religion. Judaism was a race, and membership in that race was marked by circumcision, prayer, Torah, and temple observance. Christianity is entered through by faith, not by blood, and its membership is marked by baptism, fellowship, prayer, the communion supper, the Eucharist, ethical obedience to Christ's demands. commands. Note, the difference is not that Judaism was based on works and Christianity is based on faith. The issue rather was, do I have to become a Jew in order to be a Christian? And the answer is no. Are there still some things you have to do? Well, yes. You need to be baptized. You need to experience faith. You need the Christians pray. They participate in communion. They obey Christ's commands. So you still have a kind of list of rules that are part of being a member of this Christian movement, but you don't. It's not the Jewish rules. That's the issue. We also have the transition from Peter to Paul as leader of the church, and then that transition from Jerusalem to Rome. So again, Acts 1:8, you'll be witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and to the uttermost part of the earth. So let's see Paul's pattern of mission as he went around the world. What was his basic strategy? You see this repeated in his in Acts and the retelling of what happens in each of these missionary journeys. He proclaims Jesus' resurrection to Jews. Some believe, some don't believe. Has kind of mixed results in that front. Then he turns to Gentiles when the opposition intensifies, and many people believe. So he's kind of a mixed success, Jewish and Gentile. Remember, he does not require the Gentile converts to take on Jewish outward conformity to Judaism. The growth of the Christian community in a given city anchors Jewish or Gentile leaders, leading to persecution of Paul and his workers. For example, in Ephesus, when he preaches the gospel there, many of the Gentiles convert and they stop patronizing the pagan deities. Well, this makes the sellers of various trinkets and people who are selling tickets to admission to the temple. They're not selling tickets, but you get the idea. They're making money off of the cult there, the Artemis cult in Ephesus, and this makes people pretty angry. You're affecting their economy, and so there's a riot there that grows up, and Paul's kicked out of town. That's a fairly common thing that happens after a short while. Opposition grows, and Paul has to leave, but he leaves behind a nucleus of a young Christian community that's starting to grow in the Lord. And then he writes those letters back to them. Paul then moves to the next city, and then he begins to write his letters. So we know about Paul from the book of Acts, but we also know about him from his own letters that he writes. And much of the New Testament are those letters. So let's talk for a moment about those letters. Scholars divide those up. We have some letters that most everyone agrees were indeed written by the Apostle Paul. And then we have another set of letters that are there's doubtful. Many scholars doubt that Paul wrote them. So we can divide Paul's undisputed letters, those about which scholars are agreed that Paul wrote them. And here's the list. Don't worry about identifying which books are on the list or anything like that. I just wanted you to see that we have these 7 undisputed letters written by Paul. And notice that they are written during his various missionary journeys if we use Acts chronology. Notice that the first letter written was very likely what we now call 1 Thessalonians. It was written on Paul's second missionary journey, just a short time after Paul had started the church in the northern Greek city of Thessalonica. To the issue of why some scholars think some of Paul's letters were not written by him a bit later. But for now, you can see we have this list of undisputed letters. We have the list of disputed letters. Sometimes these are called deutero-Pauline. Deutero means second, or to me, not a second class or a second list. The Roman Catholic Church calls these letters deutero-Pauline. And here's that list: 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and then I've given you the date they're most likely were written by Paul, and then the date if they're pseudonymous. Pseudonymous means a false ascription. If each of these letters says it was written by Paul in its own writing, it's each document that listed here on the left says, I was Paul writing this. But if it wasn't Paul, then someone is using Paul's name, and that's called pseudonymity, a false ascription. And again, we'll talk more about why some scholars might think that is the case. But notice that First Timothy and Second Timothy are great dispute from scholars. Those tell us about Paul's the end of Paul's life. He mentions he's very depressed, not depressed, but at least he's discouraged, and that he's confident that he's about to be executed by the Roman government. Very different than what we find in some of the other letters. But we'll talk more about that a bit later. Let's talk very briefly about so what were these letters like in the Greco-Roman world? You know, when we're reading these letters of Paul, First Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians, etc., we're reading other people's mail, and we've got to fill in a lot of gaps. So we have to think about what is the genre here? What's going on? Well, let's talk about letters in the Greco-Roman world. Letters in the Greco-Roman world, typically the length of those letters was between 90 to 100 words, so pretty short. Not much longer than maybe a long tweet or something like that. You know, they're not very long at all. 90 to 100 words. Well, tweets, I guess, are characters, aren't they? So 90 to 100 words is just not really long. Maybe like an email would be a normal length of a letter. Paul's letters, however, if you add them all up, they average over 1,300 words, so they're much longer than the normal letter that was written in the Greco-Roman world. The content, he modified the letter form to create a kind of new literary type. We call it an epistle, just a fancy word for a letter. The address of Paul's letters, by address I mean who is he addressed them? To John, to the church in Ephesus, to the church in Corinth. Most of his letters are communal in nature. That he's not typically writing them to individuals. There is one letter that is written to an individual. It's called Philemon. But for the most part, Paul is writing to groups of people, to churches. So that's why we call them communal. Paul uses genuine and specific addresses. So these are not metaphorical groups of people. They're not groups of people imagining he's writing to. These are real historical places: Rome, Corinth, Colossae, Philemon, Philippi. All of these are real, actual places, and he's writing to real, genuine people. Letter writing is, it's interesting to know, and this will, just a couple of points about letter writing in the ancient world. Paul often included in his letters a final section called paraenesis. These are ethical sections ending Paul's letters in which he gives them a list of kind of guidelines or rules of do's and don'ts. And it's in kind of quick staccato fashion. Love one another, pray without ceasing, flee idolatry. You find this just list of do's and don'ts. So these are ethical sections that often end Paul's letters, instructions for good living. And here he was probably drawing on a common tradition that was already preached in the church. And then finally, a little bit about how the New Testament arranges the letters. They are generally by length. So the longest letter of Paul is the letter he writes to the Romans, and it comes right after the book of Acts. The second longest letter is 1 Corinthians, comes right after Romans. But then we have 2 Corinthians. And so they are generally by length, but if we have a couple of them, then they're going to be grouped together. So 1 and 2 Corinthians are together, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John are all together, etc. You get the idea. So generally by length. So that's a good introduction to Paul and to letter writing. And we'll have more to say about letters and about this issue of pseudonymity as we jump into the letters to come. All right. Thank you for listening. I hope you're having a great day. Goodbye.